Welcome to Trailblazers. My name is Aleem Punja. Today we celebrate women, empower them to use their voice, and commit to supporting a more gender-inclusive world. We are so fortunate to have with us two women who have been at the forefront of addressing imbalanced social systems and supporting equity for women. Joining me today are Nurjehan Mawani, former chair and CEO of the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, and her daughter, Her Excellency Aliya Mawani, the Ambassador of Canada to the state of Kuwait. Born in Kenya, Miss Nurjehan Mawani is a lawyer, public servant, diplomat, and lifelong volunteer. She began her career as chair and CEO at the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. She spearheaded groundbreaking guidelines on women refugee claimants fearing gender-related persecution. This was an international first, recognizing the ways in which women experience violence and conflict. She then pivoted her career, serving in Central Asia and Afghanistan as the diplomatic representative of the Aga Khan Development Network, the first woman in that role. Nurjehan is a recipient of the Order of Canada and has been recognized for her outstanding dedication and commitment to advocating for the principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Her Excellency Aliya Mawani also has a law degree. She serves as the Canadian Ambassador to the state of Kuwait. She has served as Senior Advisor to Canada's Minister for Foreign Affairs, was head of the Political and Economic Section at the Canadian Embassy to Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, and Yemen. She has an extensive career from working with the United Nations to Global Affairs Canada. Also the recipient of many awards, Aliya, like her mom, is passionate about pursuing equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you've had extensive involvement in Jamaati service and an impressive career in the Canadian Public Service, and later with the AKDN, the Aga Khan Development Network. Can you tell our viewers today how your journey began and what motivates you?
Well, I think I'd like to start with growing up in Africa, in Mombasa, because I think it was at that time, it was colonial rule, and all around me, there was evidence of various colonial policies of discrimination, of exclusion, of injustice. And I became acutely aware of this just very early on growing up. And maybe part of this was that in our home, it was never an issue.
Right.
And we would have different people always coming in for advice from my grandfather. And so here we were now in an environment where there was separate development, even though it was not apartheid. Mm-hmm. It was separate development. And but the hope in all of this was the Aga Khan School.
Right.
And I think to me that was a really defining time when the Aga Khan School opened its doors to everyone of all races, of all creeds. And this was actually frowned upon at the time by the colonial provincial government. Mm-hmm. But there was leadership, and and that happened. And when that happened, I realized that things didn't have to be the way they were, that they could be changed, and that it needed leadership, and that you could change. So I think that was a very formative experience for me. And that stayed with me throughout. I wanted to be a lawyer so that I could help to perhaps be part of the change. Then I went to the UK, and I think here, perhaps it's important that how involvement and engagement in institutions, Jamaati institutions, had such a big impact.
Aliya, Your Excellency, you currently serve as Canada's ambassador to Kuwait. Was there a defining moment in your life that motivated you to pursue a diplomatic career? And can you tell us about your journey and how did it all start?
So, Aleem, I think it was a series of moments, maybe rather than one specific one. I think having heard Mum speak, you can probably tell that service was kind of in the air, in the water, when we grew up. And in fact, Mum's first official Jamaati role, I think, was as legal member on the council in the UK when she was pregnant with me. So it really does start right at the beginning for me.
Of course.
And
runs deep.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, of course, that was a really pivotal time when, the resettlement of refugees from East Africa, from the community was happening. And so I think that was also, in a way, a springboard for Mum's later career. But I think for me, again, I grew up with it, very much. And, when we think of diplomacy, we call it the foreign service or the diplomatic service. So service is really inherent, in what we do. So in this case, it's service to Canada, in my case, service to Canadian citizens, and also hopefully, in some way at a broader scale, when we're able to bring things together and hopefully help solve problems. And I think in many ways, I've always been inspired by people's stories and connections. And so this really gives me the ability. I've been fortunate, throughout my life. I've been lucky to travel quite a bit. And so I've always been drawn to that, but more so actually living and embedding, in different places, like learning what makes a place tick, what makes people do the things that they do, what are their hopes, their aspirations, and then through that, creating connections and hoping to that those connections also help us solve problems. And just at a practical level, in all honesty, I had sworn for many years that I would not become a lawyer because I didn't want to follow exactly the same path. But I realized that if I wanted to pursue my passion for advocacy, then law school was probably a good idea because it does help build your foundational credibility. And so I did that, but when I graduated, I actually didn't want to pursue a career in private law. I wanted to do something else. And so I was choosing between actually journalism and law, and then a family friend, actually. It was kind of a right time, right conversation circumstance, and said, well, the Foreign Service exam is happening next week. Why don't you give it a go? So cool. And so very fortuitous. Somebody, in fact, who throughout the course of my life, I've had some quite well-timed conversations with. And it was quite an arduous process to get through it all. And so what I decided is that I'd give it a go. And that if I got bored, I would do something else. And it's 20 years in now, and I'm not bored yet.
It's so good to hear. So I'm a bit of a Twitter junkie, and I remember seeing a tweet from you, and you talked about how so much of diplomatic life happens behind the scenes. What does this mean?
That was the night that we arrived in Kuwait to begin our family posting, my posting as Canada's ambassador to Kuwait. And, it's typical when you're starting something like that to capture the moment. And I thought, well, I could do a formal shot, with the person who's receiving me at the airport, or I could capture what this actually looks like, in reality, where I've had, a then 6-year-old at the time who stayed awake through 2 flights only to pass out in the airport VIP lounge. But I think more than that, I think the message I was trying to send, and I think it's very real, and it's not just in diplomacy, is that it takes a family, right? It's a team effort. So yes, I'm on the posting, but my family has embraced the journey. Their lives have changed completely. They've moved to an entirely new place, new schools, new jobs, new everything. And it really takes all of that to make it work. Right. And I think it does in a lot of circumstances as well. It does take a village. I mean, we certainly experienced that, I think, growing up, with Mum's career and all the Jamaati service she was involved in. There were a lot of members of our family who, were part of the support ecosystem, not to mention my dad, and now my husband as well. And so I think to me, it's important that people see that because it's part of the reality of what it takes.
Well, I have a really interesting question for you. And at different times in your career, you've addressed a whole bunch of different themes and challenges. And a prominent theme has been around equity. It's been around really addressing the injustices with marginalized groups and women in particular. And so in the early 90s, you were appointed as chair of the Immigration Refugee Board of Canada. And so as the first woman and visible minority in this position, Nurjehan, you played a key role in Canada's approach to dealing with women refugees. What were some of the changes that you made in your tenure?
Well, I think the most important thing is that it's about active listening. So I'm going to pull back a little bit to say, what is it that we did? What is it that took us to that place, and what were the outcomes? So when I was appointed the chair in 1992, and I was in the hearing room, listening to testimonies, and it was a team. Again, it was a large board. There was a working group dealing with, and listening to the stories, particularly here of women who were describing the violence that they had suffered, or serious discrimination that they had endured. And very specifically, it was because they were women. This was targeted because they were women. And unfortunately, what we found is that the convention, the Geneva Convention, which defines who can be accepted as a refugee, did not really take women's experiences as women into account. And so we found, this is about listening, but it was also about saying, well, there has to be something wrong with this, because you are excluding a whole group of refugees who are not being, because of the definition, the way the definition was framed. And the definition came after the Second World War. So I think what we did was to say, let's find a way. And so you needed to build lots of alliances, you needed to review laws, policies, international conventions, and we were able to, within the definition, the existing definition, under particular social group, bring in women who were going through these experiences of violence based on what we called gender-related persecution.
Interesting.
And that's where we had these guidelines, which since then became it was a first for Canada, and then became global. The guidelines were called Women Refugees Fearing Gender-Related Persecution. Wow. And Canada was the first country to recognize this.
Tell me about your experiences at those policy tables. What did it look like? How did you persevere through? Because I'm sure it wasn't easy.
Well, I think it is about building alliances. Very important. And I think you have to be certainly it's really important that can fall within the law, that you're not inventing something. So your creativity is about how you bring a particular set of circumstances within the existing law. Right. And then building alliances. I think the international community, particularly the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the lawyers associations, the refugee lawyers associations, we became united in this effort, knowing that there was injustice here. Absolutely. And it couldn't be allowed to go forward this way.
Aliya, you're spearheading an initiative on gender-based violence, and you're carrying out your mom's legacy and, of course, building your own. I think it's important to say that. And it was interesting because I was reading an article in The Diplomat where you talk about your own experience with gender-based violence. And you say, and I quote here, early in my career, I found myself the target of gender-based violence in the workplace. I was targeted specifically because I was a woman. The behaviors involved were different, ranging from the physical to the psychological, but equally damaging. So tell us, how did this experience shape you and influence the work that you're currently doing?
So I like to think that there's a quote from Maulana Hazar Imam or from the poet Rumi for almost every situation in life. Unusually, perhaps, I'm going to go with Rumi on this one. Okay. And the quote is, the wound is the place where the light comes into you. Wow. And so I think that resonates with me when I think about the experiences that I had, because they are part of me, absolutely. They inform a lot of what I do, a lot of the effort that I put into, for example, raising awareness about gender-based violence and trying to support people. But the experiences also don't define me, right. And I think that that's really important. I was very, very lucky in terms of the experiences that I had people who believed in me and who believed when I talked about what I had experienced, because not everybody has that.
Right.
And so as a result, you know, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that the experiences made me deeply, deeply angry. You know, I don't think it's something that anybody should actually have to encounter at any point, let alone as they're starting out. But, you know, what happened, right? And so I think for me, really, it is, when I think of the concept of the light, it's like, okay, well, what am I going to do with this now? Right? And because I had those pathways, because I had people who were in my corner and who believed in me, and I had pathways in the workplaces that I was in to file a complaint or to do what needed to be done, you know, my motivation really became to try to ensure as much as possible that I was doing everything I could to make sure that those things weren't happening to other people. Experiences like this, I think, can really create self-doubt. Right? Because often there's a tendency on the part of other people around to be like, are you sure you're not making too big a deal about this? Are you sure that this is really, you know? And I think that it's really easy to give into that and to second guess yourself. And I think it's so important not to. And I think finally, I think one of the reasons that I found it important to do what I can is also that I think we still have a sort of stereotypes, right, about who these things happen to. And there might not be one, but you know, so many people, it's still about, well, where was she and what was she wearing and what were the circumstances and could it have been misinterpreted? And also maybe somebody, for example, who is not necessarily as well educated, or, you know, there's all sorts of things. And I, in many ways, I don't fit what most people would have as that stereotype, or many people would. And so I think for me, it's also just important to say, look, these things can happen to anybody. Right? And and as a result, like, we have a tendency sometimes to dismiss, you know, gender-based violence. Unfortunately, we don't take it as seriously as we should. But somehow I think that maybe by making it a little bit more universal and saying, actually, no, anybody can be affected by this. And it's not about, you know, who or where or what, you know, that person was doing at the time. We all have a responsibility. And I'm hoping that by doing that, it raises awareness amongst people who might not, you know, take it as seriously as they should.
Well, you know, thanks so much for being vulnerable with us. And I think this significantly will resonate with our viewers today. When you wrote the article, Words Matter, but Actions Matter Even More, and it was about your experience returning to Canada after serving for 15 years. And you were struck, and I remember this vividly, and we've had multiple conversations about this, is you were struck by what has and has not changed. And so what do you think, why do you think we're still talking about what we're talking about, the same issues 30 years later?
Well, when I came back from, as you said, from having served in Kyrgyzstan and Afghanistan in 15 years, I have to say to you that I was shocked to come back to a Canada where there was such an obvious, it wasn't a rise, but an expression of racism in such a, so palpably. Anti-Asian racism, anti-Black racism, and then it reminded me of sort of Islamophobia in the post 9/11 scenario, and which still exists. But so all forms of anti-Semitism, all forms of othering, all forms of intolerance and violence, actually. So it wasn't just that I don't like you, but it was pushing senior people. It was very distressing. I was in Vancouver at the time, and here we were. I felt like such a letdown, because here we were abroad, always touting Canadian values of tolerance and inclusion, and you come back and you see that where are we? What has happened? In fact, domestic violence increased during the pandemic. There's so many studies around this. Gender-based violence has increased. So all forms of really, in a way, it was anger too. But where was all this coming from, right? So I think what it made me realize is that we've come a long way, true, but we have still a long way to go. And so it's a work in progress. So I took it upon myself to join others. So, for example, the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia had started a whole initiative. A number of us joined that. This was happening across the country. It was, for me, my perspective, it was really a call to action to say that we as individuals can't step back and see, well, that's not happening to my particular community. That is a temptation.
Yes.
And it's happening to somebody else. And so maybe I should sit quietly and maybe this will pass me by and I won't be affected.
Right.
Absolutely the wrong thing to do, because it will not, plus we are all connected.
Yes.
And so it was in that sense a call to action, and it was a reminder of our journey.
Right.
But it also, you know, Alim, what it reminded me was that we have this incredible heritage as part of the Muslim Ummah, where inclusion is part of deeply embedded. This is not something that happened in 1986 in the passing of the Employment Equity Act. Very important. It's not when DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, have become really important. In some cases, I wish they weren't just buzzwords. Yes. And just appointing one person to say, well, let's just look at this and look at numbers, tick off the number, you know. Yeah. So there is, but it's happening, and now there is much more attention being paid to this. But it was really, in a way, very inspiring for me to know that we must come from a very deep-seated heritage where inclusion was, in fact, inclusion and excellence through inclusion was state policy.
Right.
Was state policy during long periods of our history.
Right.
And so when I looked at the Employment Equity Act and Embracing Change and other initiatives, yeah, they resonated, but I had a sense of deep pride of where we were coming from. Yeah. And so I think that's something I would really urge us all to remember.
Right.
So to take it to that depth, it was important.
Tell me, we've had conversations about Maulana Sultan Mahmud Shah and your deep reaction to the messaging around women, and share with us your thoughts, your own mum's thoughts as well when this happened.
Well, I think that Maulana Sultan Mahmud Shah was so central in the transformation that happened to the role of women. Yes. Women, just not in the Ismaili community, but much broader to Muslim women. I mean, some of the most powerful, compelling speeches of Maulana Sultan Mahmud Shah is at the time when he was president of the Muslim League, reminding women of their place, their equal place, alongside their men, whether it was to pray, it was for education. And so that transformation, that was transformational. And if I think of my sister's generation, what a change that was. There were, girls' education. If you have 2 children, you can afford to educate only one, educate your daughter first. That's legendary, but it's part of our DNA. Right. And so I think that was, and then watching my sisters, and then watching, my generation unfolding, and then look. So we are all standing really on the shoulders. Yes. But, and then I look at the work that Maulana Hazrumam has continued in this. And the members of the Noorani family have continued in this as a reminder all the time. So I think we are very, very fortunate.
So we'll be remiss to not have this conversation, and because we've been talking about trailblazing and we've been talking about diplomatic life with Aliya, and now I want to talk about your life and the time when you were the Aga Khan Development Network diplomatic representative to Kyrgyz Republic, and then subsequently Afghanistan. It was at a very pivotal point in the global context. And can you speak to the work of Imamate institutions and of the initiatives currently underway to promote gender equality, as well as peace and security?
my experience has been where the uniqueness of the Aga Khan Development Network, but of Imamat's vision of creating this diplomatic channel to be able to promote the work of the network, promote it, but to represent it.
What a fascinating lever.
It's a phenomenal lever because, and it was and I've often said this, that to be sitting at a diplomatic table among diplomats is very nice, but what do you actually bring to that table? And what we bring to that table, because of this incredible way Maulana Azimam has structured this, is we bring together the lessons that we learned in the field through the implementation of programs and policies. Grassroots, community-based, and every single time it's about improving the quality of life. And so you would be very often at policy tables where there would be a discussion about, for example, in Afghanistan, I remember the national development strategy for the country. And there would be discussions, and it was clear that the people at the table were thinking of a one-size-fits-all in a country that is incredibly diverse. But what we could bring to the table, and my voice there was in fact drawing on the experiences of the development agencies who were in the field, who would come back and say, well, you know, this actually isn't working as well. But the community is telling us, and we're going to work on this, and our ability to be nimble, our ability to not course, but course correct where necessary. So you would be able to bring this to the table, and I can tell you, it did almost every time inform government policies. On gender, all of AKDN's efforts, development efforts, put women at the center of development.
It's part of the fabric.
Part of the fabric in knowing, and Princess Zahra, I think, expressed this very eloquently when she was speaking at the webinar on the State Bank of Pakistan, when she was talking about the importance of gender equality for the network. And then she's describing why this is so important, because women's role in families and women's role with respect to the way in which women manage resources for the family. So being educated, health, but by financial literacy, access to finance, so that would allow that. So I think that it's always been a very centerpiece. And I mean, Maulana Hazrat Imam has so often spoken about the fact that nations which exclude half their populations are not meritocratic.
It leads me to think about and really talk about the Young Ambassadors Initiative. And Aliya, I know that you're really passionate about this, and I would love for you to talk about the mentorship program in Kuwait that you initiated. And you've challenged young people to be brave, creative, ask important questions, and contribute to complex challenges we face. And so can you tell us more about this mentorship program and how building and creating and supporting these young leaders will enable us to progress towards a more equitable world?
Sure, and you're right. I am very, very passionate about this program. I think, we tend to often think about learning as being one way. People who are less experienced learning for people who are more experienced. And I've been very lucky, as you can tell, to have lots of experienced people around, including at home. But my experience has actually been quite different. I find that I learn every single day, from younger colleagues, from younger people, from students. Who have, new ideas, different ways of doing things. Even the questions they ask are different. I find they're actually braver in a lot of ways than the questions that I might have asked at that age. They have different language, and frankly are less patient. And it's because, as is right, because we live in a very complex world right now. We've got some very pressing issues that we have to deal with. Climate change being one of the most existential and the most important. We don't have time to waste. right? And what I find is that a lot of young people, they're not getting bogged down in politics. They're not getting bogged down in seeing, I think often as we go through life, we look at something and we often see the obstacles first, right? Before we see the solutions. And I think that that's why intergenerational conversations are so important, is because we need people in the mix who actually see the solutions, what needs to be done. So really, with the young ambassadors, it's kind of the purpose really is to help equip this young generation. So of course this is taking place in Kuwait, where I'm based. It's a partnership that we've launched with the United Nations in Kuwait and the British Embassy, and we have about 23 embassies and international organizations that are participating.
Wow.
Yeah, and we have it is, and it's great because they're so excited. And this is UN agencies, the ICRC, other countries as well. So it's great. And we've got geographic diversity, which I think is also very important because everybody's approach to diplomacy is different, and the ways that we message and the ways that we prioritize. I'm very happy to say that pretty much all of the women ambassadors in Kuwait, it's a very, very feisty group. It's great. Everybody's on board, which is excellent. And so what we have is we have a group of over 30 high school students in Kuwait from public and private schools. So many are Kuwaiti, and then others are expats from different countries. Turkey, Pakistan, India, the Philippines, quite a few different countries actually. This is a mentoring program that matches these students up with a participating host organization for a period of months. And really it's about leadership development and mentoring to help equip them to become advocates, for social change. And in particular, we anchored this around Sustainable Development Goal 5, which is gender equality and women's empowerment. But really, in essence, it's about helping them to become the best advocates that they can be for equality of opportunity for all. So again, the program has different components. So for example, we take them to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kuwait so they can sit in on, a diplomatic meeting. We had actually Canada's Minister for International Development, Harjit Sajjan. And we had that as part of the program. He actually met with all of the young ambassadors. And then we had discussion groups that he was involved in with members. And what we did is we connected civil society groups that are working on issues of gender equality with the students so that the students could learn about what's happening in the ecosystem, but also the groups themselves could connect with the next generation. So that's, and we've got a whole bunch of activities planned. And then of course, mentoring is part of that. And it really grew from, you've probably heard, there's a lot of ambassador for a day type initiatives that go around. And really what this was an attempt to kind of expand on that, to create some deeper connections and leadership development. So that at the end of this experience, it's more than just kind of getting a taster. It's actually getting real exposure to the practice of diplomacy, and then hopefully how that can create change.
Tell me about how the viewers here and all of us can really do change, and some of the work that you're doing at a grassroots level. What advice would you give to people?
Sometimes I think we get a little bit paralyzed in terms of wanting to do something that's important or big or make a change. But I think to me anyway, I think it starts with a couple of things. I think first of all, looking at what it is that you care about, right? What resonates with you. So again, for me, it's based on some of my past experiences. It's also based on what I've been exposed to, over the course of my life. Looking at, yourself, your family, your friends, like what are the things that people need? Right. And so it can be, I think some of the things that are most impactful can often be actually quite small things if we think of them ourselves, but they can really make a big change for someone else. So, in my case, I've had, very, very pivotal conversations with certain mentors, like I said, just at exactly the right time, and which set me on a different path. And so for me, those conversations were life-changing. For the other person, it probably took 10 minutes out of their day. And they might not necessarily think that they're making a major impact, but they were. So I think that there's different kinds of ways that we can do it. And again, it might be about listening to somebody at the right time, making sure that they feel heard. It might be about looking at your family or your community. Like what is the need?
Much of the work that you both do satisfies the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and Ali, you talked about that particularly, and it addresses social and environmental priorities such as quality education and climate change. Nurjehan, as you look into the future, what concerns do you have as a mother and a grandmother?
I think what worries me is probably the most now, as I look to the future,
Yes.
is the impact, the fragility of our world, and the impact of climate change.
Right.
And in some ways also how climate action is going to impact on people.
Yes.
Because that's going to be huge too.
Right.
So we need to, as we think about that, we need to focus on, and what we are, nature, it's a divine gift,
Yes.
as Maulana Hazir Imam has reminded
Yes.
us.
Yes.
And we need to see it as that divine gift,
Yes.
and to be stewards and to be faithful stewards,
Right.
not just responsible, but faithful stewards in this. And I think calling it for what it is, which is an existential threat, is very important. But with that, what inspires me is that the AKDN has already launched and made commitments to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2030, and the whole system is engaged and engaging. We have tremendous leadership that in this area, and the work has already started. I mean, I'm just looking at the AKU Challenge, University Challenge recently again, and so I think it gives me worry in terms of where this can go, but there's also, I'm inspired by the fact that we are now saying yes, we have to address it, and we are addressing it. And I see the AKDN as a pace setter in this, in terms of private international development agencies, but in that sector, I think it's going to be critical. And perhaps, I don't know if you saw recently, but there is another very major initiative which is about how putting indigenous communities at the center of the global efforts to safeguard nature.
Yes.
And there's just been an agreement signed with many countries, a global agreement, that 30% of the planet's resources are going to be protected.
Right.
I mean, this has never happened. This has never happened. So it's like this, it's now the time. And so, yes, the concern, but equally inspired.
Well, Aliya, what's your advice to people who might be watching and inspired to enter into public service and diplomacy? What's the wisdom that you can share with us today?
So I hope people do feel that way, because I do think that in the world that we live in today, I think diplomacy and public service, Jamaati, Seva, different institutions, I think it's incredibly important. So one of the first things that I would say is make it known.
Okay.
And that was a piece of advice I got early on in my career, as a young diplomat. A senior official in our department basically said, I'm responsible for staffing of many embassies for the next however many years. And you're doing me a favor if you come and tell me that you're interested, because I can't possibly know who's out there.
Wow.
Right? And he said, I need people's ideas and creativity. And it was really great, because it actually flipped things on its head for me really early on, because diplomacy can be, a very hierarchical endeavor. And I think there's quite a bit of that actually that plays out in our institutions as well. There's quite a bit of hierarchy. And we don't always see it that way. Right. And so what it meant is that I actually put myself forward for things right from the get-go after getting that advice, and consequently got opportunities. And it's something that I have told everyone that I've mentored ever since, and not just budding diplomats, but others as well, right? And again, it's not just about saying, hello, I'm here. It's also about, the why, right? Why do you want to do this, and what do you bring? And so I think just making that known is really important. I think reaching out to people who are, in the fields that you're interested in doing is really important. I think social media makes that more possible than ever before, because you can find people, can find their profiles, but also networks. We have some great networks within the Jamaat, but also through people, right? And so I think that's very, very important, because those conversations can help steer the path.
That's powerful. And Ali, I have a closing question for you, if that's okay. Sure. Yeah. So you're being featured on the Ismaili TV as a trailblazer. So what does trailblazing mean to you?
I think that's an interesting question. It's also an interesting one to answer with my mother sitting beside me. He's like, sort of the original family trailblazer. But I think that, that really kind of hits it is that I'm where I am right now. And again, I'm on a journey, right? This is the current stage in this journey. But I am very much where I am because, trailblazers like my mother and like, many others, a lot of women, but also a lot of men as well, right? Opened doors for me by doing what they did. And in so doing, showed me what was possible. Right. And so when I joined the Foreign Service, for example, I didn't necessarily think, oh yes, I'm going to be an ambassador one day. But at some level, I think because of what I'd seen Mom and others accomplish, I knew it was possible. Yes. Right? Yes. And that is really important. And so, for example, quite a few people have asked, how does it feel to be, the first Muslim woman to be appointed a Canadian ambassador abroad? Yeah. And that's a huge honor. It is. But to me, I think the most important part of it, at least for me anyway, is that it's the demonstration effect in terms of the message that it sends to others who might identify with me in some way, that it's possible.
Nurjehan, we're going to be closing with your with your aspirations for the future. We talked a little bit about that as in your role as a mom and a new grandmother, but as you think about aspirations for the future, what comes to mind?
My wish and aspiration is for a kinder, gentler world where we understand how intricately linked we all are and one ecosystem, and where hope replaces fear for everyone.
You've often said, and I think it's right, as we look at the world today, that the instability and divisiveness of societies is infectious.
Yes.
And at the same time, you say, so is hope.
Yes.
So can you give us, in conclusion, just a sense of the infectiousness of hope from your experience?
Yes. Well, I think I mentioned in my comments, to me, one of the most important issues for any society, in any part of the world, is that it should be driven by hope. The moment that people of any generation, of any age, lose hope, it is a very, very damaging thing for that community, that society. So, creating circumstances of hope is to me very, very important indeed, and much of the Arkan Development Network, their work is to try to assist countries to become countries of opportunity. That is one of the main goals that I have, is that as many countries where the community is living should be countries of opportunity.